Hey everybody, this is Mr. Wagstaff, starting a new unit and really cool stuff to talk about. Alright, so in this unit we're going to talk about how America is going to end up getting into a civil war. The whole next unit is on the actual Civil War. This unit talks about the issues that cause America to get into a civil war. Let me start out by saying this. The Civil War is over slavery. Alright, it's kind of odd that I have to explain that, but because slavery was such an evil institution in the United States, people today really want to distance themselves from it, and there ends up being this desire to not necessarily downplay it, but distance individual people from it in entire regions. Slavery absolutely was the reason for the Civil War. I can't really justify why people are trying to not say that, because historically it absolutely was the reason for the Civil War. And by what I mean by that, if the institution of slavery did not exist, there would not have been a Civil War. All right, the states' rights versus federal rights and all that stuff. People try to split hairs on that. Well, the reason the states' rights and the federal government got in heated arguments over this, which is going to lead to the Civil War, is because of slavery. There is no other issue in the United States that would have led to a Civil War had it not been slavery. So I want to get that out there ahead of everything else, because it ends up being a strong argument by people that are wrong, historically speaking, that it was over states' rights versus the federal rights. And we will talk about the issues between who gets final say-so and how things are run. Is it the state governments or the federal governments? Yes, that is one of the things they're going to fight. The Confederate States of America will break off and say that the state should make the decisions, and the federal government's like, the federal government can make the final decision. And then people are like, see, that's what it was over. States' rights or federal government. And what did they want the right to do? Have slaves. It wasn't a tax, it wasn't a tariff, it wasn't a, manifest destiny. There was no other issue that would have possibly have caused the Civil War other than slavery. So I want to get out there and to start here as we talk about this whole unit. By the very end of this unit, the first shots of the Civil War are fired, and it is based on slavery. So we're going to spend a lot of this unit talking about slavery and the tensions that are going to exist in the United States because of slavery. All right. So let me make myself smaller here. Beep, 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 beep. Oh, come on, self. There we go. All right. Beep, 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 beep. Put myself up here in the corner. All right. So, the name of this unit is The Coming of a Civil War. I had a professor in college that it's The Coming of a Civil War. He was from up north, and he was actually a macroeconomics professor. Had nothing to do with history. But he would, if I had time in class, I'd tell you all the awesome stories he used to tell us. He'd make fun of us and himself and everything else, but he was so observational on the weird things that we say in the South that you don't notice unless you live here. One of them being, if you're driving down the road and something comes out in front of you, what do? He's like, in the South, y'all say slam on brakes. He's like, it's slam on the brakes. And I'd never noticed that before, that we say that all the time here in the South. And now it drives me insane because he pointed it out to me that we say that. But he would every day point something out to us, and he talked about the Civil War. He's like, y'all say war like water, and we're like, what? He's like, it's like the Civil War. Anyway, without the context, that's not funny. I realize that. All right, so again, we're going to be talking about what leads up to this. The war in the United States, the most brutal war America's ever been a part of, is when we killed each other with the American Civil War. So this whole unit is leading up to the tensions that cause that. All right, the North and slavery. Let's start out here. So there's this concept called sectionalism. All right, let me go ahead and show it to you, because I'm going to use the term sectionalism all the time during this unit and leading up to it, and you'll see it in test questions all the time. So I want to be very clear what that means. It's a big word, simple meaning though. Sectionalism is just this idea that there are three unique cultures in the United States: the North, the South, and the West. The West, those people moved out there to be left alone. So more or less at this point, as far as any wars or violence is going to take place, the West is, you can kind of ignore them right now. When they talk about sectionalism in the United States, they're talking about the different sections between the North and the South. A lot of tension is going to be between these two groups because of slavery. All right. The North has gone almost exclusively to industrialization. All right. Big urban areas, big cities, they're mass producing stuff, they're selling it all over the world. The South has remained very rural. Massive plantations, though. And they're selling exclusively, there's some areas up in here that still sell tobacco, but the Cotton Belt is this area that swoops all down here into the South. Cotton is the big money maker in the United States at the time for the South, all right? That is how the South makes money. They have to have slaves in order to produce the amount of cotton they need in order to make a whole bunch of money. Let me point out a couple things early on here. Most white people in the South did not own slaves, all right? However, almost every single person that did own slaves was white. That is true. However, you had to be very rich to own slaves because slaves were extremely expensive by the 1800s because you couldn't get more slaves from Africa that had already been banned by the world. So there's no transatlantic trade of new slaves coming in. So the slaves that exist here are really, really expensive and they're very valuable. So the only people that could afford them are really rich people who would buy them from other people. So plantation owners who have these massive plantations, if you owned one slave, you're probably rich enough to own 100 slaves. So it was a very small percentage of people who owned slaves, but almost all the owners were white, and pretty much every slave was black of African descent. All right. So those stereotypes are relatively accurate in history. There were probably extremes and examples, rarities on either end, where there might be a black slave owner, which did exist, or there would be white slaves. The way that would work is typically, even as awful as slavery is used like a rape situation where the slaves are raped by the owners, and then they have children that appear white, and then maybe like that child gets as horrific as you can imagine, where you could have a slave that looked blonde hair and blue-eyed, but if they're born to a slave, they're a slave. So there could be that example. So I'm sure there are unique situations throughout the time, but for 99.999%, the owners are white, the slaves are African American. And I don't even want to use the term African American yet because they weren't considered citizens, so they were Africans. All right, they were slaves. It was a separate class. We would today use African American as a differential of a race, but I'll talk more about the term African American and how that can be confusing in history. So of African descent. So there were free black people in the South. There absolutely were. There weren't probably a ton. There were considerably more slaves than there were free black people in the South. So you have these tensions between the North and the South. So the North has gotten rid of slavery. And the moment they got rid of slavery, they realized, they're like, yeah, we don't need slaves anymore. It's not a thing we need up here. And then as soon as they get rid of them, they're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we had slaves. That's evil. You know who still has them? The South. And they're like, the South, you need to get rid of your slaves. And the South is like, what? No, because the South needs the slaves so that the rich people, their plantation owners, can make a lot of money. So the North is telling the South they have to get rid of their slaves. The South is like, absolutely not. Here's where hypocrisy comes in, all right, which is a staple throughout history. Even with the, all men are created equal thing with Thomas Jefferson, yet owned slaves, that's hypocrisy. The South is going to point out the North's hypocrisy. The South is going to be like, hey, North, y'all are the ones that are buying all our cotton from us. So the North is making a ton of money because of their manufacturing. Well, what are they manufacturing? They're manufacturing stuff made out of cotton. You know where they buy all their cotton from? The South. So they buy it from the South, make the plantation owners that have the slaves rich, take all the cotton, make it into stuff and then sell it to the rest of the world. So the North is still making a bunch of money off of slavery. So that the South is like, why are you coming at us? You're making bank off of slavery too. And the North's like, no, we're not. They're like, if y'all weren't buying it from us, we wouldn't have slaves. Like, we wouldn't use it. I don't know if that extreme is true, but the North is absolutely benefiting from slavery as well. So when the North is looking down on the South is like, get off your high horse. You're just like us. All right. So this leads us to a woman who is going to write a book. When the Civil War starts, Abraham Lincoln, you may have heard of him. He is the president. We haven't got to him yet. He is not the president at this point in the story, but he will be the president during the American Civil War. He's going to meet this woman, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and refer to her as the little lady that started this big war. All right? So what Harriet Beecher Stowe does is she writes a book. Now, we have mentioned this woman before in a previous unit. In the previous unit, her name was Harriet Beecher, and she was actually against the women's right to vote movement. She is the one who said that women raise all the men and therefore already control the men in society, since women instill their moral compass into the men when they raise them. So therefore women don't need the right to vote because they've already raised all the men, and the men will vote the way that they were raised. Also, that it could tear apart the family structure. That was what Harriet Beecher said. All right. This is the same woman, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Why is her name different? She got married. All right. So Harriet Beecher Stowe, she comes out. Really interesting story on Harriet Beecher Stowe. Kind of sad. She loses a child, gets sick, and the child dies as an infant. And she is horrified by it. And it just tears her up, and she like never really fully recovers from having a child die, like in her arms, because she saw the child sick. There's nothing you can do, and watch it die. Then she's like, wait a minute. I'm a rich white woman in the North, and my child died, and I'm horrified by it. Yet in the South, there are slaves who deal with this all the time, of having their child taken from them to go be a slave and never see him again. So her agonizing heartache of knowing that her child has died, she realizes this happens all the time, inflicted on somebody else on purpose for financial gain, as slaves, as children are taken from their parents in the South. She, because she lost a child, feels like she has an understanding of the pain and anguish that slaves must go through in the South. So she's going to sit down and she's going to write a book. Her book is called Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it is going to be crazy famous. Now, super quick rundown of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Here's what the plot is. Again, it's a fictional story. All right, this stuff didn't actually happen, but it could happen. There wasn't like alien spaceships show up. All of this could happen. All right. So Uncle Tom, he's a slave and he works for an owner. The owner treats him relatively well. All right, and Uncle Tom is like the lead slave on the plantation. However, the owner gets in some financial trouble and has to make some money, so he sells Uncle Tom. All right, and Uncle Tom feels very betrayed. The term being sold down the river is a term for like betrayal. Is actually comes from Uncle Tom's Cabin, where Uncle Tom is sold down the river to another plantation owner, and he is separated from his family and all of that. It gets even worse because the guy he sells him to is a alcoholic and treats Uncle Tom really bad. Uncle Tom doesn't understand why he keeps getting in trouble is mainly because his owner's a sack of crap. But so he keeps trying to like work hard. He's like, maybe if I can just work harder, I can appease the owner. I can do everything. And then one day the owner gets drunk and beats Uncle Tom to death. That's the end. It's a lot more moving parts in the story, and it is a fantastically written story, but it is not a feel-good story at all. It shows you the horrors of slavery. And she writes this book and prints it in the North, and it becomes a huge bestseller, all right? And people are like, oh my gosh, is this what's happening in the South? Because people knew slavery existed in the South, but now Harriet Beecher Stowe, through books and thanks to Horace Mann at public school, that it is able to be spread out among everybody. And everybody has access to it. And they are horrified by it. Her book is going to fundamentally speed up this process in America of hostility against slavery from the North focused on the South. So this is Uncle Tom's Cabin. The only book Once this book starts selling, the only book that sold more copies than Uncle Tom's Cabin was the Bible. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a massive, everybody read it, right? And it got everybody worked up, right? Exactly what Harriet Beecher Stowe wanted them to happen. Like, something's got to be done with slavery because it's such an evil institution. Now, very interesting, one of the reasons Uncle Tom's Cabin is such a famous book is because Uncle Tom's Cabin gets made into a play. For political purposes, mainly. There's a lot of people who are still illiterate and can't read a book. All right. So what they do is they make plays to act out Uncle Tom's Cabin to get the message of Uncle Tom's Cabin out to more people in the North. And it's extremely effective. Everybody goes and sees the plays at Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this is supposed to be the original American troupe. This is a poster for a group that reenacted Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is a famous scene near the end of the in the book that I didn't tell you in the synopsis. Very intense book if you want to read it, but it is not a feel-good book. All right. So Uncle Tom's Cabin is going to motivate the North to adamantly want the South to get rid of slavery. Now, you're messing with the South's money supply. The South is not going to take this kindly, and they're going to be very defensive once the North starts telling them you should get rid of slavery. All right. The South says that Uncle Tom's Cabin is full of lies. They're like, this, it's complete made up. It is make-believe, which is true. It is a fictional story. And the South goes so far, and man, this back and forth between the South and the North is really, really interesting. The South says, this is a bunch of lies. Like, it's all made up. And while they probably won't come out and say this to admit any guilt, they're like, yeah, there's probably bad plantation owners, but a slave is worth like $60 or $70 or $80,000 in modern money. Why would somebody go and beat them to death? That's like taking a Porsche outside and like destroying it. Why would you do that? That never happens. All right. Then the South says, the North, you're hypocrites. All right. Not only do y'all make all the money off of off the cotton, but this is a crazy stat, and so it's important to understand both sides of this stat because this stat can be used to really manipulate slavery. This is a true stat. The South says, all right, North, here's why you're hypocrites. Being a slave is better than working in your factories. And this North is like, what? And they're like, yeah, a slave has a longer life expectancy and a higher standard of living than a northern factory worker by law. Now, what they mean is, and it's actually true, that a slave has a longer life expectancy than northern factory workers. All right, that is true. Because when a slave gets sick, you can't have a slave die. So these rich plantation owners have a doctor come over and help nurse the slave back to health. If a factory worker gets sick or injured, just let them die. There's another immigrant outside that's willing to replace them. So in large part, that is why there's a longer life expectancy. The higher standard of living is that the South, a lot of places would have these laws put on owners, but they weren't really enforced, where you had to feed the slaves 3 times a day, which owners did because they work better when they're not hungry. You have to give them new clothes every season so that they don't like get sick. And owners would do this because you get better production when they're warm in the winter and they have 3 meals a day. Owners typically did that. In the North, it was hard to get 3 meals a day. You just couldn't afford it. All right. So the South is like, yeah, so before you start on your high horse, your factory workers are treated awful, which is true. And we'll talk about that in later units. Slaves actually have a higher standard of living and they live longer. So get off at how evil this is. So you're like, oh my gosh, is that true? That's crazy. Oh my gosh. Here's what the North responds with, and this is an extremely important argument that the North makes to show you slavery. Then they're like, oh, okay. Well, if it's so much better to be a slave than a factory worker, how come no factory worker escapes a factory and runs down south to be a slave? Yet, slaves will escape slavery to run up north to be a factory worker. Explain how that works if it's so much better being a slave. The South doesn't have an answer for that. The reason that is because the true horrors of slavery, all right, It's not having enough food. It's not physical punishment. It's the fact that as a slave, you don't exist. You don't matter. Your existence is ignored. You live to work. When you die, you get an unmarked grave somewhere, and your entire existence on earth, your one life you had to live, just doesn't matter. You can't make any decisions, who to marry. You don't even get to see your own kids. They might get taken from you. Like, the horrificness and evilness of slavery, all right, is so much more than the physical abuse that the slaves would be subjected to. So the North would respond about this is no slaves gonna run away. So once the North says no factory worker is going to run away to be a slave, tensions continuously build between the North and the South. As soon as they tried to make it like a constitutional issue, they were like, well, it's just all men are created equal. Like the North will say all men are created equal, so there's no way you can have slaves. Here's the argument. The South will say, oh, all men are created equal, are they? Well, how come George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, guys who wrote the Declaration of Independence, guys who wrote the Constitution, guys who formed the entire fabric of American society, they both owned slaves. The guys who made America owned slaves. So how can you say it's unconstitutional to own slaves when the guys who made the Constitution owned slaves themselves and didn't say, oh, that's wrong, let's get rid of them? They just ignored the whole situation. So you can see already that tensions are rising and that there's no simple solution to this. There's no like legal cut and dried decision on how this is going to proceed forward. So there ends up being some movements at the time that are going to try to alleviate this. So there's two concepts that we're going to talk about: the abolitionist movement and emancipation. These are important for this unit and the next unit. And I want to explain to you here what the two differences are. A little cartoon here. It kind of explains it, but not great. Maybe just me telling you it will help you better. So there's a movement of people in the United States that want to abolish slavery. Abolish slavery means to make slavery illegal. So if you're a slave and slavery gets made illegal, guess what happens to you? You are freed, all right? Emancipation means freeing the slaves, all right? So if slaves are all emancipated in the United States and all the slaves are freed, all right, hooray. But if you don't abolish slavery, all right, so abolish is bigger than emancipation. If you abolish slavery, all the slaves are set free because there's no more slavery to hold them. If you just emancipated all the slaves and freed all the slaves, but you allowed slavery to still exist, they're just going to grab other humans and subject them to the same thing in the evil institution that is slavery. So if you abolish it, you're also emancipating slaves. So abolish means get rid of the laws. If you just free all the slaves, but you allow slavery to exist, then slavery still exists and it can just rebuild up with other people as slaves. So the abolitionist movement, the movement to make slavery illegal, grows. And not surprisingly, is going to grow in the North, all right? And the South is going to adamantly fight against it. Evangelical influences. We had talked shortly in the last unit about the churches starting to split in the South to justify slavery. On the other extreme in the North, the churches start to adamantly get involved in this abolitionist movement where they're like, no, this is not a Christian way of doing things. And so the church, which means the evangelical influences, the churches start getting involved and start fighting against this absolutely horrific situation that is taking place in the United States with slavery. So churches are involved. The abolitionist movement, they get, at the time, they would be referred to as very militant. They got very aggressive against this, against the concept of slavery. Was not taken kindly by the South at all, but most of the abolitionist movement is going to take place in the North. Groups of people that are against slavery and trying to push to have slavery outlawed across the entire country. Now, in order to do that, who has to be the one to outlaw it across the entire country? That would be the federal government, all right? So here's where the tension is going to start, and we're going to talk about it as we move through this course. The North believes the federal government has the right to tell the South slavery is illegal. The South is like, yeah, the federal government can't. Federalism says when we create a constitution that the state governments and federal governments have to work together. Neither one is stronger than the other. So the states get to decide whether or not they keep slaves, and the federal government has no say-so on that. That is where the argument between the state governments and the federal government is going to come in. Who has the final say-so on slaves? If the states get the decision, the South is going to keep the slaves. If the federal government's going to get the decision, all right, with the influence by the abolitionist movement, most likely slavery is going to be outlawed. Lots of tension, all right, at the time. So the anti-slavery movement is kind of like the Emancipation movement, is where they want to free them and move them out. So the abolitionist movement want to outlaw the slaves, and then the anti-slavery movement is similar for this little graphic here. They're pretty much similar. But the abolitionist movement, the anti-slavery movement are very, very strong in the North. Doesn't really exist in the South because, again, the South completely relies on slavery for money. All right, so there's another dude. Actually, there's two guys here. Let me put my face over him because we'll talk about William Lloyd Garrison. I should probably just put these on two separate slides. We're going to talk about Liberia first. So there is a thing called Liberia. There's a country called Liberia. All right. AHI Asman creates Liberia. Is a big piece of land. It's right here in green. All right. It is a big piece of land in Africa that the United States actually purchases. Because the argument is, or one of the questions is, all right, if you free slaves, what do you do with them? Like, the idea that you're just going to let the slaves stay and be citizens and, like, what we just know ends up happening and work great. That was, like, crazy talk. So even though the North is, like, against slavery, they're still racist. It's still where manifest destiny comes from. They're like, they're slaves. They're inferior people. What are we going to do with them? Just ship them back to Africa. Well, there's no, like, African country that they were from, so America buys one. The country of Liberia, America buys it. AHI Asman works for the United States government. He buys it. They actually make a capital in Liberia called Monrovia, named after James Monroe. Still is the capital in Liberia today. It's the only capital in America, in the world, named after an American president, other than Washington, D.C. Only capital outside of America named after a president. So Liberia gets built for a back to Africa movement. If you free all the slaves, here's where you take them. Even though we bought Liberia and we set it up, it never came to fruition. There's never a back to Africa movement. It had been talked about at different parts in history. It never happened. So Liberia today is their own country with no influence by the United States. But that is how it originally got developed, as a back to Africa movement. Now, the next guy in the abolitionist movement, William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison is probably the most hated abolitionist in the South. So he lives in the North, all right? But he writes a newspaper. And all he does all day is talks trash about the South and how morally inferior people in the South are and how awful they are and how wrong they are and everything that they do. So he has a newspaper called The Liberator, and he is the editor of it. He is extremely influential. There is a series called The Abolitionists you guys will watch. Talks about him in detail. William Lloyd Garrison is pivotal in the abolitionist movement. He said slavery needs to end now, immediately, yesterday. Like, there's no redemption. There's no gradual process. It needs to end now. You can't, like, schedule evil to end. All right. William Lloyd Garrison, as the founder of The Liberator, the newspaper, ticked off the South because he would say all types of crazy stuff. He was an extremist. He was awful. Well, it's interesting, as tensions grow between the North and the South, William Lloyd Garrison doesn't seem as crazy. So when he first comes out and he's demanding the end of slavery right now, immediately, it just seems like wild and crazy talk. But as tensions get crazier between the North and the South, he starts making a lot more sense. His views haven't changed, but everybody else's crazy basically catches up with these extreme ideas that he has, where you just gotta, you just gotta cut it off. So William Lloyd Garrison, very famous as a newspaper editor of the newspaper The Liberator, and the South hated him with a passion. All right, so if you've noticed, I won't have questions in here randomly for you, lined up for you. So what I want you to do is answer them as you go through, which you surely have been doing. as always, pause me when you get to those questions from here on, because I'm not going to have the questions anymore in the PowerPoints because there's no need to. Because you guys know the routine at this point with this many units in. So whenever you get to a question, pause me, answer it, and then move on. So that's my expectation of what you're doing when you're getting there. All right. That is as far as we're going to get today, and I will see you guys tomorrow.